Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the last webinar of our series. So the topic of today would be what future for Europe in the 2040 Sahel. We're really glad to have a very prestigious panel, and we are looking forward to the discussion this morning. So I will give the room to Max from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for a brief introduction, and then we'll start the discussion.
Thank you, Djenabou, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, which is the third and last one on our series of webinars we had on the Sahel region in collaboration with the FRS. And thank you, Djenabou, again for your commitment. So as CAS, one of our main topics is security, and we recognize the vital importance of the security and stability in the Sahel region and across the African continent. So we as CAS also have decided to be present in the region with a regional program in Bamako in Mali, which is led by our colleague Ulf Lessing, who might be present today and who was a speaker in our last webinar and also really actively helped us both with the program and the selection of the speakers. So thank you again also to Ulf, who should be here. We already had two interesting webinars in November and December, which focused on the different developments in the Sahel region, and where we focused for the first webinar on the question whether Franco-German strategy actually is possible in the Sahel region, and on the influence of the new actors in the Sahel region, which we discussed in the last session in December. So today, at our last webinar, we really want to talk about the relationship between Africa and Europe, and we want to shed a light on how the Sahel region or how the future possible role of Europe can be in the Sahel region and the horizon of 2040. And for that, we have our speakers. Djenabou will more precisely present them in a second. So it's Anna Schmauder, Beatriz de León Cobo, and Anne Savey. So thank you all for being with us today and giving us insights on that really important topic in the Sahel region. So once again, thank you, Djenabou. And I now wish us all a very enriching discussion on this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. We're really pleased to have the following panelists with us this morning. So first of all, Beatriz de León Cobo, who is a researcher and analyst specializing in security, conflict dynamics, and violent radicalization in West Africa and the Sahel. Her main interests include countering violent extremism, political and conflict analysis, stabilization, and armed group dynamics, especially in West Africa and Europe. She's also a PhD candidate in sociology at the Sorbonne University, specializing in radicalization. She works as an independent consultant for governments, NGOs, international organizations, and she's also an analyst at the Center for International Security of the Francisco de Vitoria University in Madrid, where she leads the Forum de Dialogue Sahel Europe, and she works as an associate conflict justice and security advisor for First Call Partners, and she's a RUSI associate fellow. So thank you very much, Beatrice, for being there with us this morning. Also, Anne Savey, an independent advisor for more than 14 years of experience in conflict prevention and peace building in West and North Africa. She specialized in peace mediation processes involving political leaders, armed movements, and civil society. She also developed skills on specific topics such as DDR in Mali, constitutional processes, or state citizen trust building efforts. She worked for international NGOs, including SFCG and the HD Center for Mediation and the Carter Center. And she developed mediation strategies, projects, and activities, managed multicultural teams in highly volatile and sensitive environments. She was recently a team member of the Independent Observer of the Agreement for Peace and Reconciliation in Mali from 2020 to 2023. And in parallel, she organized the first strategic workshop on peace mediation for French institutions, MFA, AFD, MOD, in 2023. And finally, Anna Schmauder, who is an analyst and advisor specializing in qualitative and quantitative conflict research in the Sahel region, with a current focus on Mali and Burkina Faso. Her research interests include the hybridity of governance, in particular linkages between formal and informal governance actors, the political economy of conflict, and the impact of international organizations. She currently works as an advisor at the stabilization platform, a GIZ advisory program to the German Federal Foreign Office, and is a non-resident fellow at GPPi, the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. And prior to joining SPF and GPPi, Anna worked with Klingendel Institute, the German Bundestag, and International Crisis Group. So again, thank you very much to the three of you for joining us. I think it will be a very interesting conversation, especially since all three of you have experience on the ground in the region, and it will be very interesting for everyone in the discussion to have like concrete returns from your own experiences in the region. So today, like it was said, it will be a conclusive webinar to address the future stakes of African-Europe relationships, but especially Sahel-Europe relationships. The Sahel is obviously at a historic turning point, which necessitates a renewing of strategies and actions for all the actors involved, and especially for the European Union. But I feel like we cannot really look at the future without addressing the past, and especially without drawing lessons from the past. So my first question would be, maybe, well, like I said, based on your personal experience, what would be, in your opinion, the biggest missed opportunity for Europe in the Sahel, and also the specific initiatives or strategies that Europe should replicate? Because we also focused a lot on the failures, obviously, but what worked and what could be actually replicated in the region? So any of you who would like to start, feel free.
I can start if you want.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, Djenabou and Max, for inviting us today to this panel and discussion. So, yeah, as you mentioned, it's a turning point for EU-Sahel relations, probably. But yes, we can try to draw some lessons and observations of what happened in, well, the last decade, let's say, and try to not to forecast what is going to happen, but try to give some analysis and maybe some advice on what should be considered in shaping future relations. So to answer your question about the biggest missed opportunity, if there is one answer, let's make it big. I would say that this missed opportunity is the potentiality of a really stronger relations, long-term stronger relation on EU-Sahel relations and cooperation in all sectors. That is clearly a missed opportunity. Why? I would say that it's because we focused too much on the security aspects and leave on the side other aspects, including development. And I know that there have been big budgets and efforts on development aid, but I'm saying that based, for instance, on the G5 Sahel, supporting the G5 Sahel at first meant there will be a very big development strategy and as a pillar, and that there will be also governance pillar and a security pillar. And at the end of the day, everybody just start focusing and even like mixed what was G5 Sahel and actually the joint force of the G5 Sahel countries. So over two security-centric agenda. We need to keep that in mind. Also, I think one big mistake in link to that was the EU started diverting parts of financial aid meant to development to provide equipment, defense and military equipment. This, I think, is part of what EU did in sending the wrong signal in the region in terms of supporting military reinforcement, military strategy with more militaries, more defense apparatus, but at the expense of other reforms and other major sectors like government, development, health and education, and it's not sustainable. So maybe it's something that we would like to look at, especially when we are the EU. I took the question of Europe as the EU and EU member states based on a model developed on cooperation, trade and prosperity, and peace. And so I really think that like along the path, the EU forgot about those overarching values and principles that need to guide EU actions: prosperity, freedom and trade, and peace. And I think this is something that could be interesting to look at for the future. Thank you, and sorry for being that long. I would like to do my best to give shorter answers.
No, it's perfect. Thank you very much. Beatrice, maybe?
Yes, I'm going to try not to repeat myself of what Anne has already mentioned. She has spanning very interesting points. Of course, I'll thank you, FRS and CAS for the invitation. It's a wonderful opportunity to discuss very important issues right now. It's definitely, I think, it's a very challenging moment, but also a moment where everyone has an open mind because we understand that there's lots of things we haven't properly done and we can do better. So I think this kind of format is very good to actually address those lessons and also opportunities. So for me, I think there's two big myths for European strategy. But again, I think it's very easy to do it from this side. As a researcher, independent, I know how the European Commission and the European Agency works, and I know it's tougher than it looks to make a decision. So I say that as an independent actor, which is much easier to judge, but I know everything is very complicated on the other side. I think the first one is definitely a branding issue. So actually, when you were asking the second question, which is, what are the experience of the EU that you think have worked the best? Anyone, if you ask of the experts in the Sahel to name EU experiences, you'll go automatically to EUTM and EUCAP. And I'm not saying they haven't done a wonderful job. I think EUCAP Sahel Mali has survived to practically everything in Mali, which means that, of course, there has been successes on the way. But it is a shame because EU has done so much more for the Sahel at every single level: development, cooperation, humanitarian aid, supporting media, supporting elections, has done everything. But the second you're thinking about EU strategy in the Sahel, you go automatically to EU CAP and EUTM. So in that sense, I think it's a branding issue, and it's probably because we have so many different mechanisms. We have the mechanisms linked to the Commission, the mechanisms linked to the European Union External Action Service, ECHO, Expertise France, FIAP. So we have so many programs that are funded, co-funded, tree-funded by so many different parties that I think, unfortunately, we haven't done a good branding mechanism, which is very different than what China, Turkey, Russia, or even Japan does. When there is something financed by Japan, there's the big Japan logo. No, I put that as an example. I don't know if the EU was smart enough on the branding of their strategy and of everything we have done. And that generated a lot of frustration in Sahelians, because every time you heard an EU diplomat go to Sahel, it started all the speeches by the EU has done these trillions of millions of thousands of trillions of euros in the Sahel. And people were asking, oh, so where are they? We don't see it. We have no idea where this money goes. And even if you go to the EU portal and you have a very big breakdown on what is the EU money going to, the average citizen does not know. And we had lots of years where actually the Sahel and especially the three IS countries and the European Union were a very deepened partnership led by France. And I think that was a very missed opportunity, because right now the relation also, when Sahelians think about Europe, they do not necessarily think about all that aid that has been systematically given during the last 10 years. And as Anne was saying, first thing automatically goes to everyone's mind, security. So I think that's a shame and a very big missed opportunity. I think the second one, and again, saying that as an expert agent and not being the one making the decisions, which is easier, is the fact that the reaction time. I think since 2022, since probably the second coup in Burkina Faso, but definitely on the coup in Niger, the EU has been in a shock, probably like ECOWAS, unfortunately, with everything that has gone on. And I think that shocked, paralyzed EU decision makers. They were all with the strategy of wait and see. Wait and see how this develops, wait and see how France acts, wait and see what Germany does, the Italian, etc. So that wait and see strategy meant that we lost a lot of momentum, but I do believe we could have made a difference. A difference, for example, in MINUSMA leaving Mali, how they left. I think that you could have done much more. A difference, for example, on supporting civil society where they needed it the most, instead of letting them all go to prison or to exile. No? I think there was crucial moments where you could have stepped up, but probably because of that reaction of fear in time, we decided not to necessarily act. And now, instead of being able to act and be able to do a bit of prospective analysis, we're just reacting, and we are reacting so late that we have the scenarios where, for example, the EU representative for Niger gets expelled after a year the crisis started. And those are the moments I think it's very clear that the EU needs to start acting instead of reacting with so much delay. Again, why is that? Because I think now more than ever, unfortunately, there is not an EU strategy. There is 27. And I think with Trump, new dynamics is even going to be more complicated. I understand it has to be very difficult to be on the same page, but I think us as European citizens, we need to definitely ask the institutions to at least agree in some common base and act accordingly, because as Anne was saying, I think it's important to have a clear idea of what we want. Is it values? Is it transactional approach? What is it? And unfortunately, I don't know if the European Union knows as an institution, and especially if the European Union, even knowing, has the capacity to act on it. So I would say those are the main missed opportunities. But I think, as I was saying before, this is the moment to react and to reflect. And there has been also wonderful things done in the Sahel by the EU. So I'll stop here and we can continue later. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's true that we have focused a lot on the adversaries, like they're always called, and what they do wrong in the region. But it was interesting that you noticed that, well, talking about China and Russia, they have a branding strategy, and that's why people have been talking about them so much. So I feel like it's always interesting to also look at what the others do right, and that can also inspire our own actions. Anna?
Yeah, thank you also from my side for having me and for this chance to conduct a reflective brainstorm, because I think that's what it's going to be when we look into the next 15 years, or at least attempt to do so. Yeah, I'm just going to respond briefly at one more point on the issue of the biggest missed opportunity. And I think it actually links back to what both Anne and Beatrice were already underlining. That to me, I think, is the fact that we as the international community, did not sufficiently recognize the critique of the prevailing and dominant approaches that were so prevalent, but still difficult to see that there was some kind of misalignment, right? I think even in 2018, 19, it was right below the surface. It was there, but you could easily say that maybe the international approach of the entire stabilization machinery was somewhat perceived as too big to fail. And maybe that was one of the reasons why it was not really taken seriously enough. Because what we see now, and it has been done in some of the studies that look into a sort of evaluation, for example, in Mali, is that there has been for a really long time critique and a feeling of loss of control by Malian state actors. One, by the sheer enormity of the international presence, the multiplicity of the different initiatives that make it really hard to coordinate. And I think that feeling of loss of control has also fed into the turn of sovereignty that we're witnessing now. And so, not saying it would have been very easy to recognize or take it seriously, but I think that has been one of the biggest missed opportunities. But if we take a step back, I mean, this is titled Sahel in 2040. So we really try to a bit look in the looking glass. And I'm thinking, in general, if we reflect about the lessons learned, I'm actually a bit more cautious and skeptical, because I'm not sure that, yes, there is a paralysis of action on the European level, but I'm not sure that actually Europe or even singular European member states are well positioned enough to act. Because for there to be an action and a reaction to such a significant historic change, there would first have to be a joint reflection process, and I don't really see that happening. What we're actually seeing much more is kind of a reverse dynamic. Much more is happening. We see an acceleration of new dynamics also in the region, at least new from 2020 onwards. And in parallel, the loss of research capacity, of analysis, of access, and also just in terms of budget, right? There's much less analysis. And I think that has led to a lack of a joint shared analysis and understanding of the situation, both actually within member states in different ministries, but also on the European level. So I guess the question would be, how do you plan for the future? How do you come up with an action plan if you don't even have a shared understanding of what is actually happening? And I think, unfortunately, that is where we're at right now. And then the other point, when we attempt an exercise like that, I think it's very easy to only look at the Sahel, but actually try to look into the future like that requires looking at both Europe and the Sahel. And I'm not a researcher on European dynamics by any means, but I think we should be mindful also during this webinar here to not lose sight of where Europe will be in this time. And I think one element clearly that we can already see on the European level in national member states is the rise of the far right. We also know that might likely, if it continues like it has in the past years, lead to a further fragmented European Union. I would imagine that European Union will become a less prominent foreign policy actor than it has been in the past. And I think those are just some elements we need to take into account as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The three of you have underlined, obviously, the numerous internal divisions within the EU, and as a consequence, the difficulty to have a shared vision, a shared understanding of what's happening in the region, like you said, Anna, but also of what they want, because that also means divergent interests and priorities. So I guess my question would be, how can Europe have what should at least what should be its top vision and top priorities for its engagement in the Sahel? What should be the mutual interests at the core of such strategy? Because obviously, if you want to, like you said, if you want to make a plan, you need to at least agree on the plan and agree on what you want. So maybe, well, if you want to continue, maybe, Anna?
Yes, thanks. The question of priorities. Well, I think that one of the main goals, very simply, should be to reconnect with Sahelian audiences, right? And clearly, that's going to be a long-term goal. So on the one hand, what is needed is a commitment to invest for the long term, which very easily competes with all the other multiple crises we're seeing, Gaza, Ukraine. So I think just on a member state level, that demands a lot from foreign policy actors. But I think it would be a mistake to think that the priorities and the narratives from Sahelian states will change if at some point the current military leaderships disappear. I think what we're seeing in the Sahelian states is reflective of a larger dynamic we're seeing from across the African continent, in which the previous European prevalence and dominance is called into question, and rightfully so. And it will become easier to question it the more diverse your own partnerships are. And arguably, I think in the United States, that has been the kind of hardest shift so far, because it has called into question and led to the dissolution of the entire previous stabilization approach. But I think that recognition is key, that this will be long-term questions asked of Europe to be more of an equal partner and to also recognize Sahelian priorities. And I think right now what we're often seeing is this framing as well, almost pointing the Sahelian states as devoid of their own agency, as being victims in a geopolitical game, rather than recognizing that there are indeed rational political reasons why you would choose the current alliances. That we have seen. I'm going to leave room for my co-speakers, but maybe I can add another point later. Thanks.
Thank you. Anne, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, sure. Well, definitely, I think the EU need to think long-term strategies and relations with the Sahel, and this is also something that maybe has been missing at some point. Also, I agree with this idea that the EU needs and have the means, I think, to take the initiative to revamp the relation. Well, first, we need to acknowledge the fact that Sahel countries, even if they build and they are building IOS, are still very different also countries. Plus, when we speak about the Sahel, do we include Chad and Mauritania, and do we include even Sudan and until the Horn of Africa? But anyway, to keep with those three countries where many political changes have taken place, I would say that the EU have the means to take the initiative, but first, as it has been underlined, there is a need to maybe to speak within and between the EU member states. I have a question. Do EU commissions and all the foreign policy apparatus as some means to try to nurture and feed some kind of dialogue over EU common priorities and interests among EU member states, because we know the divides, we know the different priorities and the different visions, for instance, about migration policy, which is big, about security cooperation, about some kind of trade cooperation that sometimes is a bit different. But what do they have in common on the EU member state sides is maybe this idea that Sahel is important regarding migration security as far but not so far neighboring areas. And it can matter in terms of geopolitics and in terms of energy and agricultural questions that are more and more important on the priorities of the different states. So maybe they could build something based on that, on an agenda like peace for security and also cooperation for trade based on maybe on a different approach, more respectful of Sahel and Sahelians' aspirations. To do that, first, maybe we need to recognize that gentes and as current governments, but generally speaking, governments and populations can have common aspirations, but also different ones and priorities. So it is very important for EU and EU member states to keep as much as possible a link with both governments, high-level dialogue open as much as possible, and also within the societies. But overall, we can say also that there is an aspiration for a multipolar order that is wished for, that is ongoing, happening right now. And so once again, is EU member states and the EU just looking at that and trying to adjust and adapt, or can the EU bring something to the table? For instance, building coalition for the recognition of the necessity of a multipolar order based on what? Based on mutual respect, maybe like the abandon of the double standards that damaged so much the relations, and we need to acknowledge that. Based also on the recognition of common interests and challenges. So, for instance, very practically, could be like a coalition for the extraction and trade of critical minerals, because the Sahel, there is a rush, there is a gold rush for gold, but there is a gold rush also for critical minerals in the Sahel. And this is also why there is Russia and China and Turkey, and why it is so also worrying for European member states. So instead of always talking about disinformation and influence, and let's also talk about that. Like why? Well, critical minerals, we all need it. Agricultural and pastoralism is also a very big subject for the Sahelians, also for the Europeans. So maybe let's talk about that, and let's talk about how it went in the past, and try to change that and to add more balance in this relation. We need to stop extract and import. Export to the Sahel, and maybe reflect in a more balanced relations. And it could be like some topics that we can put on the table and advance a discussion on that with countries, with Sahelian countries where the relations are not maybe in I mean, at first, well, in the first place, not as bad as they get with the three Saharan countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, but also with those countries. So yeah, critical minerals, agriculture, and pastoralism, but also, for instance, information. And once again, I invite also, if someone is listening, the European institution and the EU member states to try to look at our mistakes before blaming the juntas, blaming the Sahelian governments. And of course, there have been mistakes on those sides too. But for instance, on the information, we know that currently press information, freedom of speech, freedom of association is and has been curbed since the military took over power in those countries. But also what we can look at is how, what kind of rule and even laws legislation is used for that. And actually it's anti-terrorist laws, anti-cybercriminality regulations that are directly inspired from what was done in Europe and in the United States. So maybe also the EU can try to look at that and try to correct some mistakes and that have been done and that have damaged the protection of fundamental rights, and try also to build some kind of coalition, like positive coalition for information, for freedom of speech and freedom of press. And I talk about coalitions, it can seem like very up in the air like that, but I think it's diplomatic gestures that if they are supported by concrete acts, supportive to the governments that would consider engaging such kind of movement, or to civil societies, of course, in terms of economic and support also to the human rights defenders, for instance, etc. It can be something very concrete and useful. Yeah, well, I will maybe stop there for now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Beatrice, and maybe if you can also follow up on this idea of how to balance the EU's interests with the needs of the local populations.
Of course, thanks. A lot of ideas have already circulated of my two co-panelists. I think for me, there is two visions regarding our interest in the Sahel. The ideal vision, which is we believe there is a way where the Sahel and Europe can be prosperous, develop, where everyone can feel a safe and fulfilled citizen. And then there is a pragmatic view regarding what do we Europeans need from Sahel, which is, do we need a stable Sahel? Because then we think there's going to be, if it's unstable, there's going to be security threats, organized crime threats, migration threats, whatever kind of threats you can imagine. And my question to the EU is, are those agendas compatible or incompatible? And I have to say, I think they might be incompatible. And I think the problem sometimes is that we try to make them compatible. And as we were explaining before, each case is an entire world. Even each country is 3 sub-countries or 4 sub-countries sometimes. So I think it's a matter of how internally can we reconcile our values, our ideas, which I think what makes EU so strong. Though we are living a crisis at the moment, but I think is what makes EU so strong, the fact that we believe in prosperity, shared prosperity for all of us, versus a very pragmatic approach. And I have to say, I am conflicted. I don't know. What is clear is when we try to do both at the same time, is when Anne was saying clearly we have double standards. Because if we want stable Sahel, maybe a very strong government that has a strict population can work on the short term. But then the problem with that is when Paul Villa dies, what is going to become Cameroon? No, I'm trying to put the regions are not the Sahel for clear reasons, but you understand what I mean. These strong regimes might be very useful to ensure stability in the short term, but wouldn't then be catastrophes in the long term. And that's a problem of EU nature, but also because we are democracies and we think 4 or 5 years, unfortunately, ahead instead of 20, 30 years. That's something China and Russia do not have necessarily to worry about, or Morocco. They think 30, 40, 50 years in advance. For us, 15 years, 2040, it's already very difficult. So I think we have a challenge, an internal challenge of decide if we are prioritizing the long term, what do we really wish? Is it that ideal versus realistic view compatible or not? And what do we want to prioritize? And unfortunately, I think the 27 countries do not have a clear answer. And that's why we all compromise. And without compromise, nobody is satisfied. And I think the other, regarding what Sahelians need from us, I think I'm not very fond of quoting necessarily these leaders, but I think they're right on the win-win approach. I think the speech or the communication the EU has done about values development, about this savior complex, does not work anymore. And that's where every other partner is beating us to the race. I think whatever we do, it has to be fairly clearly an approach that seems a win-win for both of us. Can be in extractive mineral resources, as I was saying. It can be also in migration. It can be also in whatever. It can be in communication, but it has to clearly be felt as a win-win for the leaders and for the population, which are not necessarily sometimes the same in the same page. So I think that will be my main recommendation. Whatever we do, it has to feel win-win for both parties, and there is a lot of common ground. But then there's also things that we are never going to be in accordance, especially with this regime, and that's fine. We work with far more complex regimes around the world. I don't know if you probably follow, but all European Union leaders has gone to Syria. I can assure you there's lots of things. We are definitely, it's very challenging to work with a new Syrian regime, and we are probably going to make it work. So I think, unfortunately, the EU thinks of the Sahel as the Sahel of 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Sahel is a new area with new dynamics, with new chiefs, new stakeholders, and even the older stakeholders has changed their speech dynamics and discourse. So even if you feel you know your interlocutor, the interlocutor has changed its point of view. So relations have changed, and unfortunately, I think probably because of human nature, we believe we are talking with the same people that we were talking 10 years ago. So again, it's a lot of reflection, a lot of cautious diplomacy, and also be honest of what we can achieve and we cannot. I think it's a lot of expectation versus reality. How many times have we promised that we were able to combat jihadism in the Sahel? And how many times? Obviously, it generates such frustration, and that also fits into the complex theories, this information theories, the fact that we weren't able to do all those things we promised to accomplish. So I would say lower expectations, but what we do, that it seems to be win-win for both parties. So we are not necessarily compromising our values, but we are also not making them feel with this colonial background as we are continuously using them for security and migration, which is the case they feel. I'm not saying is the case, I'm saying they feel is the case. So I think it's a matter of a more structured and cautious diplomacy we need with these new leaders. But I see my co-panelists have lots to say after this, so I'll stop here and give them the floor again.
Yes, thank you very much. Any of you, Anne or Anna, would like to start?
Anne was first.
Yeah.
But I will be very brief. You want to go ahead? Or? Okay, thank you. Well, I just wanted to stress again the points made, because I think what is very crucial is the necessity, especially in a more multipolar order, for the EU to move away from this previously normative approach, right? Where there was even shying away of really naming interests that are the reason why Europe has been active in the Sahel, and then moving towards a more pragmatic, as has been said, approach, which also means first defining what are actually the points that we want to stress. And I think one point that was made by Anne very convincingly is that we need to move away also from the only topic being the securitization, the security focus, which is mainly motivated by the main strategic interests of the EU so far: migration, combating migration, and preventing irregular migration and counter-terror. And it has been added by a third one, which I think arguably could be actually a hindrance to future engagement, which is to prevent the sphere of influence of Russia in the southern neighborhood, right? And if you look into policy bubbles right now, you hear quite a lot of times, well, we need to stay engaged. We cannot leave the Sahel to Russia. And that, even I understand the notion, is a really bad reason to stay engaged, because obviously it is something that is very easily being picked up by Sahelian audiences. Doesn't even have to be those in power that then can rightfully claim, well, it has never been about us. You only care, because you're afraid to lose your own influence. So I think that actually requires quite some rethinking what is our own reason independent of Russia, and what then can be actually up for debate, because the previous approach of, well, here are the European strategies and priorities, and we will make it work, as has been done, for example, with the migration law 2015 in Niger, even against actually national interest, because let's be honest, there was not really a Nigerian interest to prevent migration up north or to prevent the transport of people up north. And I'm not sure, I would be a bit more skeptical about the notion of win-win partnerships. I think that should be the goal, but I think looking at the more pragmatic outset and the fact that well, the sovereign turn will not disappear even if the current leaders will be gone in a few years, maybe, requires also for the EU not to win, but to lose on some points, maybe, and to actually say, well, we might not think it's realistic, but I think that would be required, because a win-win, I don't think that's possible. So maybe that means defining, well, our number one priority is migration and everything else can be compromised. Or it means moving away from securitization and also including the European trade policy into our stabilization attempts of the Sahel. Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Anne?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, to go on this idea. Well, on my side, I would say that I think actually that idealist and pragmatic need to reconcile on the prospect for EU Sahel relations by 2040 or even on the longer term. Why? Because I think that the most ticking bomb in the Sahel now is conflict, is violence, is more and more men, mostly, with weapons, with gun machine war weapons. And this is not just about human rights. It can be also about very like pragmatic and sensitive aspect of economy, trade, and security. And so I think that actually everything should be looked and thought through this lens, that we need to support everything we can do to stop conflicts and stop the expansion of guns, military weapons, and combatant training in the Sahel. And this is something that will be good for Europe and good also for the Sahel, because right now there is a ticking bomb about like thousands of men that are trained, or even if they are not trained, they use guns and war weapons on a daily basis, what are we going to do with all these people? And when I say we, it's like global we, but mostly it's going to be about, it's going to be a burden for Sahel institutions and Sahel regimes. And what are they going to do about that? What are they going to do about the VDP? The VDP now are more numerous than the militaries themselves. How are they going to absorb them at some point? Or who is going to absorb who actually at some point? So I think maybe like for Europe, it would be very useful to look at that. And so once again, need to support dialogue, stop of the fight, stop of the skyrocketing increase of military budgets and acquisition of equipment in the area. And I think it's something, if we, in the dialogue with the different governments, that once again we need to have, and regardless of if we think that there are bad military autocrats or good military democrats, because like everybody is dialing with Mauritania without any democratic issue apparently. So regardless of the regime, we need to keep dialogue with those countries. But when we do strategic decision about what kind of cooperation, how we do it, I think that what should be the north to have some clear direction is: are we going to fuel the conflict? Are we going to fuel the violence? Are we going to support peace prospects? Of course, peace is not for tomorrow. We know what is the situation now. Maybe we didn't made a sum up here about the situation, but we know that the prospects for peace, dialogue, and security are not good at the time, because violence has spread and increased so far. But this should be what we look at. For instance, about migration. Migration is top priority for some European countries. For instance, Italy. We understand why, because they feel they need to handle this burden by their own mostly. On the other side, Europeans can turn a blind eye on different different strategies they decided to implement by themselves. It doesn't work. It doesn't work well. What I want to say is, curbing migration can be an objective as long as it doesn't fuel the conflict. And we know that it has actually been the case in Sudan, in Libya, but also in the Sahel. So we need to look at that. And also, I agree about this win-win perceived cooperation. I would just say that it's need to be win-win, just not just for the governance and the regimes, but actually for the countries, so government and populations. Because what is also the results of the EU Sahel relations today, after a decade of massive aid and strengthened cooperation, is this disillusion shared by lots of Sahelian people. It's because there is the double standard. It's because Europeans are full of values, but then when it comes to, for instance, apply the duty of vigilance that has just been passed by the EU Commission, well, we come with pretext about we don't want to apply this directive on vigilance for EU firms because Trump is back, and so we are going to lose markets if we do so. We need to be very coherent about our speech and our acts. And I think at this condition, we can keep the speech about values, but we need to be coherent on the acts. And when I say pragmatics and idealists can actually join together, I think there is a lot to win about acting like this for both regions. And yes, there are going to be sometimes short-term losers, maybe losing a bit for some companies. But once again, the beacon should be how end the conflict, not fuel the conflict, and support peace. And well, actually, for instance, now the fact that violence and combatants are spreading in the area are also resulting in more cost for trade, for trade, and so it hinders the mobility of people and goods. So yeah, I think that really if values and acts are aligned, and if we keep the necessity to end conflict as a beacon, well, pragmatists and idealists can actually come to some arrangement together. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anna, I saw that you wanted to react.
Yeah, just very briefly on a double standard, because it has been mentioned, I think it's really crucial, right? The fact that actually, when we think about the Europeans positioning in the Sahel, we do not look only in the Sahel, we need to look at its global actions, and we need to look at the global actions of its member states. So the understanding that how a member state or how the European Union positions itself in one conflict directly impacts how legitimate, how credible it is perceived in another conflict. I think we have seen this with Gaza. It is a topic that is brought up very regularly when you talk to people, not only in the Sahel, but globally. And that is kind of a long-term, impact that we still haven't really fully grasped, I think, and that brings enormous risk with it. The other is, of course, more immediately in the region that, of course, European countries and the EU as such is rightfully called out when unconstitutional changes of power are criticized and punished in one country but not in another. And then the tricky part of that is, I think, that very easily in the current discourse, one EU member state can easily be conflated with the entirety of the EU or the European Union. So that there is not really the protection for member state to say, but we acted right, you can still be conflated in this discourse. And I think we need to prepare for that. And then secondly, just briefly on the tension that Anne rightfully mentioned, that yes, there is a discourse from current RS and military leaderships, to broaden the level of engagement, to also look at economical avenues, and to move a bit away from only the securitization. But at the same time, it is the most pressing issue, and it is the one dynamic that is influencing economics, development, humanitarian issues, and also issues of interest, like you mentioned, access to critical minerals. So then the question would be, if our own understanding of how to solve the crisis and how to lower violence directly contradicts the one that we're seeing in the region, how do you overcome this tension?
Thank you very much. You all underlined obviously the need for a long-term vision, the need to align this vision with the needs of the population, the need for a win-win, but with some, at least a pragmatic approach of this win-win, which also means reconciling with not just governments, but local populations, but also accept that at some point it's not going to be a win right away. And you also insisted on the fact that there was a hyper focus on security. So my questions following up on that, it will be a double question actually, because you said that obviously we need to move away from the normative policies. So my question would be, how can we move away from it? Especially since you said that we need to reconcile the values with the pragmatic approach. So concretely, should Europe still play a role in governance reforms and transparency, or should actually Europe abstain from leading a role in that matter? And the second question would be regarding security. What should be the new approaches? Because we did a lot of capacity building. So how can Europe be involved on this front, but in a more sustainable way and in a way that aligns with everyone's needs and interests? So I don't know if someone wants to start.
I'll go ahead then. Really complicated. I would say that I think it's a delicate balance, and to try to do everything, but I think there's some contextual changes that has happened that we can not deny. So as Anne was saying, I do believe the main difficulty of the Sahel nowadays conflict, clearly, and the fact that the social cohesion of some of the Sahelian countries, it's so fragmented that I believe the justice and reconciliation processes and the DDR processes that are going to have to take place are going to be painful and are going to be long and are going to be very complicated. So given that that's the main challenge, we cannot neglect the main challenge, which is conflict. And therefore, we need to continue being invested in security, regardless, even if we do it in an idealism way, because we believe in protection of civilians and human dignity, or we do it in a pragmatic way, which is there's going to be all these refugees that will come to us. In any case, conflict is still a major issue. Nevertheless, security is definitely the most sensitive topic to discuss with those governments, because they believe in a new, how do you say in French, souveraineté retrouvée, a new refound sovereignty, which means that whatever we do, we need to do it with them. I think especially the regimes, so not the population, but especially the regimes have accused us to try to undermine the central authority and to try to work directly with civil society, and that has generated lots of tensions. I'm not going to say it's easy, but that's why we have multi-sectoral approaches, no? And I think here it's a delicate balance between continuing supporting the efforts of the population, and which means also civil society, but also continue working with and maintaining dialogue with whomever is in charge. And again, we've done it in other scenarios. So, and it's a delicate balance, and we have a lot of political decisions to be made. But I think those are when we can definitely reconcile our pragmatic and idealistic, which is this region has a massive conflict, has a massive problem with social cohesion, and no matter what, that's not going anywhere. And even if we think that by working on the Gulf of Guinean state, we can approach what is happening in Liptako-Gurma, I'm sorry to say that's not the case. The problem is still there. The issues are still there. And maybe this is a bit unfair to say, but I think they have clearly sent us a message, which is we want to do this ourselves. I think sometimes the European Union and the West in general, not only us, have a role in the conflict indirectly, which is we do not necessarily generate sustainable approaches when we do anything between development to security approach. And very simple one. Now there's a lot of embassies that has stopped and left. A lot of programs, aid programs, France, but not only, also the Swedish, others that have stopped and left. How many civil society organizations are really starving in the sense of they don't have any budget because one day European Union countries or the Western countries have decided to stop and leave. Probably understanding the repercussions they have, but nevertheless deciding to stop in and leaving. I think that's what I would recommend for next actions, no matter if it's in security, in governance, in economic development, whatever we do has to be sustainable. We need to ensure that when we leave, we haven't generated a bigger damage than if we wouldn't have been there on the first place. And that is exactly the critique they have with our security approach. And when I mean they, I mean civil society actors, population, and governments. They think we make the decision ourselves. We decide when to go, when to leave, how to go, how to leave. And I think there's a lot of frustration, and I'm talking not necessarily of in the government level, but on the population level, of abandonment, feeling of abandonment. We've been there and we've left, like if it was business for us, and lots of organizations depending on us. So whatever we do has to be sustainable. That will be my key message. And if we are not able to do something sustainable, then we can try to support, but it has to be then themselves that solve the issues they have. And if that means having painful and long conflict process as we have had in Europe, then it means that's the chemin, the thing they need to know exactly the pathway they need to cross. So we need to also be able to live with ourselves and our decisions. But whatever we do in the future, I will say sustainable. I'll stop here. I want very keen to hear my co-panelist on this.
Thank you so much. Anne?
Yes, thank you. Yes, definitely long-term and sustainable. We need to like reflect based on these two pillars for sure. On governance, I would just say like, well, first, ask the Sahelians, both at the government level and the population levels. So of course, we need to adapt to what is the situation now, the difficulty of the relations with the regimes in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. Also, the divergence of the trajectories that are currently proposed and enforced in the Sahel. Well, as an observer or active observer of the Sahel for the last decade and more, at least one thing I think I understood about the crisis is that there is something about citizenship, social contract, the mandatory need to transform this relation between states and populations, to recognize the diversity of the population, the diversity of the territories that makes the different countries. And this is not, I think, this is not the trajectories that are currently taken. So this is something we need to look at when we think about supporting governance somehow in this country. So really be aware of what are the current trends, which are about re-centralization, dismantling decentralization steps that have been taken, including with problem about sustainability, budget, etc. So now it's about more centralized power with strong men, but also with the fact that in Mali, one of the first measures that has been enforced was the nomination of military governors in the region. So we go back to before the decentralization, before the 90s. In Niger, the different mayors have been replaced by also special delegations that are appointed by central authorities. So yeah, this is a massive trend that is clearly, I think, problematic with some roots of the crisis. So we need to look at that. And at the same time, actually, the territories are less governed because the state is actually less present, and I mean outside the big cities and big areas. So we need to be aware about what are the current trends. We need to ask the Sahelians. We need to be, yes, less normatives when it comes, for instance, and I'm French, so I will say it, when it comes, for instance, to laïcité. Like, we need really to drop that. Let's be very clear. I don't know what is going to be the solution for the Sahel or how it will be in 20 years, but I can clearly say that religion, Islam, is taking a bigger and bigger part in the society as like socio-cultural practices and norms, but also as a normative, as a norm for politics, for justice, etc. This is a fact, and I don't know why, as Europeans, we should fight against that. We should start the dialogue on governance and maybe on our will to influence in terms of gender equality or things like that, but start the dialogue with Islam is norm, is a base, and it's going to be more and more that. And even if it's military at the head of those states, it's going to be that way for sure. On governance, I would say also, yes, as Beatrice mentioned, that supporting research, local CSOs, prospective dialogues, in support of local civil society actors, but also supporting the dialogue between civil society actors from Europe and from the Sahel can be also a constructive for everybody, and a strong mean to keep relations and to keep Europe in position to play a positive role also in the future, because that way you keep the link, meaning you know the people, you interact with them, you build relations even at a personal levels that will feed European institutional reflections, and that will also fuel your and strengthen your capacity to act tomorrow when there is, for instance, an opportunity to support peace dialogues efforts and stuff like that. I would also say that on security, well, first, I think that Europe should remobilize to prevent the worst from happening in the Sahel, meaning that today people are already targeted for their ethnic or community belonging, especially in Mali, in Burkina Faso. If you are Fulani, if you are Tuareg, if you are in certain areas. For now, it's not, for instance, it's not the case in Bamako, but people feel more and more vulnerable they are more and more afraid. If tomorrow there is another JNIM attack, for instance, in Bamako, would Tuareg and Fulani population and Arab population be targeted as some kind of, retaliation? Yeah, this is something that is, it's not a vague idea. It's something like very present, and I think on this aspect, Europe could do more to mobilize to prevent those actions from happening in capital, and to use more ways to denounce what is going on in some areas. But in northern Mali, for example, but also be more supportive of the civil society actors from the Sahel and from Europe that are working on these cases. So supportive means finance, yeah, sure, but also I don't know, like facilities to travel, facilities to meet and dialogue, facilities to enter into contact with international organizations in charge of investigating those human rights abuses and violations. One aspect also on security, I would say that, how to support in an innovative way local forces. Well, once again, ask the forces and the governments what they want and what they need, and after that, assess, analyze why they want to use it, because if we better equip militaries to fight terrorism, but the regime first priority is to fight political opponents, then maybe we need to be aware of that when it comes to capacity building and technology sharing, for instance. I agree also, it has been said earlier, but be very clear about what you are ready to do and what you are not ready to do. You are ready to help to fight terrorism. We are not ready to help to fight with no discrimination on civil populations, for instance. Also, I think that support to local forces should maybe take a more closer look on security forces, because maybe fighting terrorism is also about fighting networks and dismantling supply chains of networks. So it's more about fighting organized crime. So it's about capacity building, training. For instance, there is Europol that exists. So maybe these are also leads that should be taken more into consideration. And one last thing is just also be careful to not make Mauritania, for instance, another champion of any EU support or strategy, because, at first it was Mali, and when Europeans started to withdraw from Mali, Niger became the champion. And even though lots of people say we need to be careful about Niger because it's making Niger more vulnerable to do that way, and also we tend to adopt blind glasses when we decide one country is the champion partners. We need to be very aware of why we cooperate together and who we are in our differences, and also in the different of views and positioning towards our populations, for instance.
I see that Beatrice raised her hand, but Anna didn't have a chance to answer, so I'll give you the floor, and then Beatrice.
Thank you, wonderful. I will be very brief, just coming back to your original question, Djenabou, on the seeming tension between approach and a normative or value-based approach. And I think one way to think about that is to look also in the terms of lessons learned at the values and the preconceived ideas that Europe spread previously or supported previously that failed to deliver. And I think one example that demonstrated quite convincingly is the origin of the crisis. So let's not forget what actually allowed the conditions for the first coup is months of protests in Bamako that started due to discontent with the electoral process. So in a way, you could say that the support and the supposed support that the legitimate government through elections as a value was supposed to bring actually did not deliver even before the military powers took control. And I think that is one example of the more pragmatic approach. Not to say that there would actually be much that external actors can do in the current situation and to influence a transition in any way. The double standards is another quite important point when we talk about governance, but we spoke already about this. So my last point is just going to be on civil society relations. And I think that there is a certain hesitation and maybe even fear to continue engaging with civil society actors based on the recognition that this engagement might be much more critical than previously the case, right? Because if you talk to citizens of the Sahel, even those that are very critical of the current military powers, you know, sometimes bring the argument, well, we are in a second phase of decolonization. So there is a whole bunch of critique that will be leveled against previous partners, even those that maybe they depended on financially for the past decade. And a precondition to have that exchange and continued support would be a political willingness to hear that criticism and also be open to maybe talk a bit more about the mistakes made and the failures made, because that has also not been the case. And there were quite a few distinct examples that then make it much more easier for the current powers to instrumentalize them in their externalization dynamic. And we have already mentioned the necessity to bring different actors together, about the fact that civil society is, of course, rather diverse, that there's, on the other hand, quite a repression, especially also as journalists, but all kinds of civilian actors that are perceived as opposition to the current military powers. And I think one concrete step would be to facilitate travel and visas for these people and to maybe European spaces, maybe somewhere in the region, but to bring them outside of the RS states. I think that could be one important step if you want to get very concrete in facilitating that exchange.
Thank you very much, Beatriz.
Yes, it's just when Anne was talking, I thought about something, so I didn't want to forget. I think if I had to summarize my thought regarding what to do next, is make it more accessible. I understand that from accountability mechanisms, the European Union has to have a certain level of monitor and evaluation tools, but it is impossible for civil society in the Sahel to work with the EU. It is really complicated, especially the smallest and the most local NGOs always needs an international NGO to receive funding, which generates an extra step, but also makes it much harder for the local NGOs to actually appreciate what the EU can do for them. It is really, really extremely complicated for them to access funding, but also to access political stakeholders and conversations. It's not only about the capitals, it's also about the rest of the country. So I'll say that at every level, it is very difficult for the civil society, for the stakeholders, for the community stakeholders to access the international community. And therefore, it is our duty to try to make it as easy as possible. And as I think Anna will agree with me, and I'm sure you also do, I think there is a a problem also when we try to reach to the Sahelian stakeholders, what we believe are the Sahelian stakeholders, because they have changed in these past few years. They have changed, and we still meet with the ones that were relevant 10 years ago, or we still meet with the ones that are less challenging to our views. So there's meetings right now where everyone agrees. And I think in a very polarized Sahel, we need to continue having hard conversations, tough conversations with them. And unfortunately, sometimes when I meet in the European circles and I see what they consider, okay, let's bring the Sahelian expert. That Sahelian expert, I'm not saying it's not relevant anymore. I'm saying it's not representative of the actual needs of the Sahel. It was representative a few years ago, but it's not anymore. So we need diversity. And with that diversity, we'll be able to really hear, as Anne was saying, ask the Sahelians. But which Sahelians are we asking? I think sometimes we're asking the wrong Sahelians. And it's not necessarily exclusively about the governments, it's about the society, what they feel, what they need. And for that, we need to have better mechanisms to dialogue with them, to dialogue at the strategic level, but especially to dialogue at the civil society level. And I truly believe it's very complicated to access EU funding, EU stakeholders in the Sahel, and it's only for a very concrete elite to be able to do it. So that will be my recommendation. Make it easier. And if there is the political will to do it, we can do it. We've done it in other regions of the world. So why are we not doing it in the Sahel? Maybe it's because we don't know with whom or how. And I think here, people like us that are experts that move in between both worlds, we can give a hand of which are the interlocutors to ask and what are the actual legitimacy of those interlocutors. But we definitely need to update our agenda to be able to have a more legitimate actors to discuss and to hear their thoughts, especially when they profoundly disagree with us. So I wish for other conversations that everyone profoundly disagrees, not nuance, but profoundly disagrees, because that is when you actually can get to settlements and to move things forward. So I heard Anne speaking, that was the idea that I wanted to say. And I think she wants now to come back on that. So I'll let you.
Yes, thank you very much, Beatriz. And yeah, we'll give the floor to you, Anne, in a few moments. Just to our guest spectators, don't hesitate to write questions in the chat if you want the panelists to address them. And you've all covered a lot of stuff. You've all insisted on the necessity to better engage with grassroots organizations, civil societies. But following up on what you just said, Beatriz, I would be curious to address what these mechanisms for better dialogue would look like, if you have like concrete examples in mind. And also, still on the topic of dialogue and cooperation, we talked a lot about obviously Sahel countries, but what about other countries? What about countries in the region, whether it's Algeria, Nigeria, also regional organizations like, well, we talk about the IES, but what about the ECOWAS, which has also experienced the crisis of legitimacy? And finally, what about external actors that are not necessarily adversaries? So we talked about Japan, but also what about Turkey? What about all these actors? Can we explore any forms of cooperation with them in the Sahel? So several questions in one. Feel free to address whatever you want to address, and please feel free to maybe be a little bit more brief so that we can address other topics. So Han, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, about mechanisms for better dialogue, I would say first, the EU needs to use all the relations and bridges and connections that already exist and have sustained along the recent period, and is probably going to continue existing in the future. So between once again between populations, between civil societies. What does it mean? I'm not calling EU diplomats to take all the time dialoguing with civil society from the Sahel, because I think it's important to do so sometime, but I think also it's good to acknowledge and recognize the fact that there is some kind of repartition of work that can be done, and some kind of complementarities that can be nurtured and supported. And I think for that, the EU member states need to better link with civil societies actors and organizations, including even diaspora from the Sahel, to support and encourage dialogue on all issues among civil society from Europe and the Sahel. So acknowledge complementarity, and so build bridges between EU diplomacies in particular and a civil society organization, maybe create some spaces to listen to what they have to say and to propose, and to support them, and complementarity and independence. It's not about EU and EU member states are going to use civil society actors and organizations to target who they want to target, or to build what they want to build. No, it's about complementarity and independence, and I think this can be very constructive. About dialogue, I would say also maybe it's a bit of a psychological approach, so I'm very sorry for that, but I think it's still operative. It's really being less arrogant, but more certain and assured about our values and our red lines. We don't need to be ashamed of that. We don't want to compete or try to make our place in this new environment, geopolitical and economic and military environment in the Sahel. We don't need to compete on the same level and ground that, for instance, Russia or China are using. And we need to look at them maybe a bit closer. And China and Russia actually are not really using the same tools. But so Europe, once again, has assets and added values that are interesting for Sahelian countries. So we need to work on that. Once again, it's maybe about supporting civil societies, etc. But it's also about trade. Like Europe is the first trade market. It's about technology. It's about common interest on the energy markets. So we really need to look at that. What are Europe assets, added value, and play on this, rather than trying to imitate in a bad way, a bad imitation of Russian or Chinese or Turkish policies. Another point, well, it's not about, but I would like to say, to make sure that we don't forget about it, it's not really about EU-Sahel dialogue, but it's about supporting dialogue efforts toward peace. And I think on this, we need also to drop any kind of condition. We need to support dialogue for peace with no condition, except a prospect for better living condition. So recognition, participation and security for all populations. This is for me like the one condition, but the rest of them, we need to drop it. We need to drop who is going to be at the table or who is not going to be. It's not how say to tell really, and we should stop also influencing on that. And one aspect also is that the EU and EU member states need also to adjust and adapt the fact that probably we're not going to be like the first or the biggest players somehow in this environment. But it's fine. It's fine. There is room for everybody. And we need to focus on our assets and our shared priorities and challenges with Sahel country. About the rest of West Africa and neighbors, maybe the EU could start a new initiative, maybe first very quietly, and then try to build up on this about the relations between Algeria and Morocco, because it's very hard to think that there will be peace and free mobility and etc. In the Sahel and in this whole area without better relations, at least between Algeria and Morocco. And European states have leverage on this. Today, we are not really using it in a good way. As I see it, it seems that our government's actions tend to fuel the resentment between the two countries instead of trying to build dialogue and decrease tensions. So I think yes, it is very hard pass, but maybe it would be interesting for an EU personality or team to work on this and try to work at the EU member states level and with the partners from Africa. For now I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you.
And also one last aspect, it's of course that the AS is in building. We don't know how much this confederation is gonna take life and be concrete on all aspects of Sahelian lives and countries and relations with foreign countries. We don't know yet, but what we can say is that anyway, the EU need to keep relations with ESCOWAS, but need to certainly prevent anyhow to ghost AS, the EU and EU member states in their own different capacities need to dialogue and have relations with the AOS countries and adapt to what AOS as a confederation is maybe becoming. Once again, I think we need to remember what is EU and what and this historical choice that European countries have made. So we made the choice to build the European Union and to bet on freedom of mobility for goods and people. We need to maybe remember that, because it is not what we have supported for more than 10 years in the Sahel. And this is also a lesson that we need to learn about it. So be very, very attentive of what the RS is becoming. And maybe also in terms of dialogue, we mention it at different moments, but maybe offer some concrete dialogue spaces and acts on how we should build clearer post-colonial relations with West African countries, including Sahel countries, but not only the three countries. So, of course, there is the franc CFA, and maybe Europe can play a role. The EU institutions can help advance this this question and this dialogue instead of letting maybe West African country and France in face to face, that it maybe not very productive. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anna.
Thank you. Very briefly on the question of regional cooperation, I think, yeah, first it's of course crucial that also we move a bit away from only looking at the now we've talked about 3 RS states, Mali, Burkina, Niger, but that we look at them in the bigger setting of West Africa, and I saw a question in the chat, even Northern Africa. I think what is crucial to keep in mind is that the focus, and we see, for example, the new German Africa strategy has been published, and one of the main points is strengthening support to ECOWAS. But I think that is also a tendency we see on the European level, which is great. And at the same time, there is, of course, a clear risk that the fact that there's an increased engagement with an actor that is perceived as oppositional to the RS states, you then risk further deteriorating the bilateral relations maybe with the member states of the newfound regional RS framework. I think with regard to Algeria and Mauritania, I'm not really able to speak in much detail about it, but what is interesting is to see that, of course, when you look at Bamako, there have been quite some tense diplomatic encounters and relations recently, mainly due to the strategy of externalizing responsibility as a legitimacy creating measure, both to Nouakchott and Algiers, and that is not true for the other RS states. So you see that there is actually not a one continuous strategy between the 3 member states and their neighbors, which I think brings some opportunity to strengthen relations, especially because there's also the issue of economic dependency. Yeah, I think that will be the main points. We probably will have time for some concluding words, because then I would also like to stress a few more points. I will make one already now, which is to highlight, in addition to the issue of necessity to engage with local leaders, with civil society that was already mentioned previously, an issue that has been not mentioned in such great detail, but I think one of the co-speakers in the previous webinar also mentioned, which is the issue of human rights. And obviously, at this very point, it's not an issue that will increase or better relations between Europe and the member states of RS. Nothing where you can win in any way. But when we speak about the future and when we speak about strategic foresight, I think it's important to prepare for the future, and that could mean simple steps just like document and invest and document what is happening at this very moment. And it's a huge issue because a lot of organizations, even human rights organizations, are banned, have difficulties of access. There are amazing reports and investigative research being done by those human rights organizations, but it is at great risk. And so I think one of the issues for the future should be to invest in accountability. Again, a topic that has been named in the previous webinar, I think, by my colleague Jonathan. But I'm always struck by the difference in conflict theaters, right? That we see a live streaming of massacres, basically, in some areas, but we only hear about it in hindsight in the Sahelian countries, and there will never be a TV crew showing us what is happening. So I think it is responsibility of European partners to invest in working with that.
Thank you very much, Anna. And finally, Beatriz, and I can see a question in the chat. So maybe following up on that, if you can expand a little bit on North African countries' role in the Sahel, what could be their role in the future?
Sure. I think it is very important for the European Union to also understand the limits taking into account the new souveraineté retrouvée, the new refounded sovereignty. So I think lots of regional organizations, all basically there's an African movement of African solution for African problems. I think here is where probably North African countries can be better placed to have a role in that cooperation between neighbors. So I think in that sense, a trilateral dialogue with the Northern African countries, especially with the neighboring countries, it can be very strategic. I think sometimes we tend to see regions as monolithic, but we need to understand that borders do not really exist on the Sahel, and that's why we've seen the crisis going from Libya to Niger to Mali, Mali to Algeria, vice versa. So I think it is important to consider all stakeholders, including North African countries, but also Gulf of Guinea countries, coastal states. So Ghana, Togo, Benin have lots to say about the future of Burkina Faso. And that's why one could argue that regional organizations, especially ECOWAS, could be the correct interlocutor. Nevertheless, I will say this with caution, because I think some of these organizations have been thought as instruments being used by us, by the West. So I think whatever dialogue we engage with them, it cannot necessarily be seen as a way of us trying to meddle in their affairs, but more as a way to have a different channel of communication, and that with other regional organizations. I think the European Union is an example of a successful integration project with all the question marks around lots of things we still need to work for sure. But nevertheless, there is things we've done correctly. And for example, with this divorce between ICE and ECOWAS, I always think about Brexit. And I think there's going to be a lot of legislative challenges of this exit. I think those are the kind of things where EU can be an inspiration, because we've done things properly in lots of cases. So I think in that sense, the EU can lend a hand wherever it is needed. And I think we can definitely support and promote North African countries to play that role of sometimes even of mediators when we cannot do it anymore, knowing that everyone has their own agenda, especially the North African countries. So when we are encouraging the mediation of Morocco to do something, it also comes as a price, a price tag. So whatever we do, we just need to acknowledge the risk and take them with what they are. But I truly believe in a trilateral dialogue, and that's why we cannot skip talking to neither the North African countries nor the Gulf of Guinea countries when we are talking about things that are related with Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. It's not a monolithic region; it's a ever-changing region, and borders do not really exist only for us, but definitely not for communities, and not for armed organized actors. And therefore, any challenge there are in the region needs to be taken as regional challenge, which means not only counting with the countries that are on the ground, on the heart of it, but with all the other countries around it.
Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes left, so I think it would be perfect for each of you's conclusive remarks, so that you can, each of you can take 2 to 3 minutes to wrap up your thoughts. And I would have like a few guiding questions for that. So considering everything we said, I would be interested in your own summary of what would be the most critical pillars of Europe's future strategy by 2040. Obviously, drawing up of everything that we've said so far. Also, how can we renew our strategic thinking? Because we always highlight the fact that we need different different tools, different softwares, but how can we do it concretely? And maybe a predictive question that would be, for you by 2040, what would be the most transformative change in the region, and how could Europe adapt to it? So yeah, just a few questions, but mainly I'll be interested in your own summarizing thoughts. So maybe Anne.
Okay.
In 2 to 3 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Well, I would say on the one hand, the EU and its member states need to come back to basics. So it's not about inventing a new logiciel or something like that. It's come back to basics on what has made Europe and the EU and what has made it an attractive partner for the others. So once again, it's a trade market, it's rich of technology and innovation and finance for humanitarian aid that is dearly needed in all the region, including the IDPs, including the refugees, even if they don't have the status of refugees. The EU needs to do something here, and they have the capacity to make a difference on these aspects. Finance also of the economic sector, because maybe at the time our diplomatic relations are not quite good, and maybe they're not gonna come back to a high level, let's say, of interaction soon. But the EU has a financing capacity and attraction for the economic sector in West Africa, including in the Sahel. How we do that? I agree with the motto launched by Beatriz, make it accessible. So I remember once a young entrepreneur talking about the BPI, this Banque de Financement Industriel in France. Well, maybe it's something that could be used as a way to promote and support economic innovation and development in this region. So finance, market. So in terms of well, energy, supplying critical minerals, etc. But how we do it? Once again, the EU and EU member states shouldn't lower their standards, but should actually be more coherent about what they say are their standards and what they are doing. The governments, the institutions themselves, or their national companies when they go abroad and they go in those countries. So once again, this direction on vigilance is something very useful. Vigilant for respect of labor and human rights and the environment. It's something that can be a good basis for dialogue and changing maybe the way we cooperate. So think about the economic sector. And then about critical pillars or other critical pillars, I would say need to change because I say come back to basics. Well, now it's change and clearly adopt a vision of a post-colonial relations in plural, between EU and maybe the IS, between member states on the two sides. So this includes how the EU and member states represent Sahel countries, regimes, populations. We need to think about that in the way we trade, cooperate, talk with them, and in the way also, for example, development aid, humanitarian aid is provided. Even when we talk, for instance, about protecting nature, national parks, etc., we need to look at the way we do things and to change that in positive post-colonial standards we need to invent together. Then I talk about how the EU trades with the Sahel, and so how the EU and member states talk with the Sahel. And I think there we said it, so I would just repeat it. It's about independence, respect, not use the Sahel or the region as a playground for EU cooperation experiences as it has been the case. We need to think based on the context there, the people there, and of course our priorities and needs, and listen to them. So listen to government and societies. Thank you.
Thank you. Beatrice.
I'll go very brief this time. You were asking at the very beginning, are there any experience of other regions that the EU has encouraged? And given what Anne said about entrepreneurs, about business youth, I will say microcredits would be one of the clear ways to help and encourage women and youth to make a living for themselves instead of these many cash for work programs. Again, let's try to be sustainable. So whatever we do in the future, we need to ensure that when we leave, we haven't generated a worse problem than the one that we've created through dependency. I think we've talked enough about our approach, but I think that the bottom line is listen to what they need. Assume that we are not the same actor we were 10 years ago, and therefore we don't have the same capacity of reaction. We have also other fronts like Ukraine and Gaza nearby us. So we are not the same. They are not the same. We need to engage in a new dialogue, a reshaped dialogue. And for that, we need to be clear of what we want, what we need, what they want, what they need at all levels. And I think their civil society, as us, we have a very important role to play. And I will finish with this, which is force our governments to do a better job at understanding what's going on. As Anna was saying, there's a lack of research and a lack of monitoring of the situation because of access to data, access to the ground. So let's make them accountable for them to work harder to get that data because people are there. It is possible. Let's make them work harder and let's ensure there is an interest on the civil society of Europe to engage more with the Sahel, because I think the four of us agree that when you get to know them, you cannot unknown them. They are wonderful people, it's a wonderful culture, and we want the best for them. So let's try to make this a priority for the European side, in a better, as Anne was saying, in a more realistic way. So I think we have here a role and a responsibility. Let's play it as much as possible, and let's try to be eager to reshape the dialogue, learning the lessons from the past, but also understanding that the actors have changed and that our capacity has changed. And whatever we need to do has to be flexible, it has to be sustainable, and we have to be able to access the new and the old stakeholders that have the power in the Sahel. And for that, we can do a multi-sectoral, holistic approach with engaging with other partners around the world, including those allies, non-European allies, such as Japan, Australia, and others, that might play a good role on the future, or even regional allies, as the North African countries when needed. So I'll finish here. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Anna.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to try to zoom out a little bit because what I want to highlight is that we know from research into autocratic regimes that the sudden falls of seemingly predictable governments of regimes is very difficult to foresee and predict, right? And which is why it is so important that on European level and in each member states, we prepare for scenarios that now seem unlikely or far-fetched, especially if we look at such a long timeline of 15 years. Like we were surprised by the takeover of Taliban in Afghanistan, like we were surprised by the fall of the Assad regime at the end of 24. And I'm bringing it up because when the Assad regime fell, you heard prominent politicians in Germany saying, well, we should have been much more interested in Syria. We should have been much more engaged and followed the relevant actors ahead of the escalation of events. And it's easy to see a situation in which the same will be said about the Sahel a few years from now, or even much more recently from now, simply because it has moved quite to the margins of the political attention and will, much more to the background, both in terms of political capacity, willingness, but also in terms of budget. And what was already stressed in the previous webinars, I think, is the fact that the strategic patience alone does not mean we just sit and wait, but we actively prepare for the responses. The concrete pillars have already been named by my co-speakers, but I think for me as well, it will be the preparation for transactional relations, which does not mean giving up on our values, but making clear which of them are not negotiable and which of them we can maybe more compromise on. And secondly, the basis of shared understanding, both with exchange to civil society, but also with experts, because we need diverse perspectives to actually prepare for the future. So maybe the next webinar will be with 3 Sahelian researchers. And to bring that to a close, I think we often lack the capacity to think that there's room for change, just as we did before the dissolution of the stabilization framework in the Sahel. So the results or the status quo is a bit biased towards administering what is right now and not with imagining what can be done. And I think for a new European strategy for the Sahel and West Africa more broadly will also depend on applying these lessons cross-regionally for West Africa, right? And that includes questions like, quite simply, what are scenarios that we are prepared for? Who are the actors we consider worth talking to? And I'm thinking that back to Anne's question about where do we support dialogue? Where do we draw the red lines? How might we position ourselves in one conflict that actually undermines how we are perceived in another, in the Sahel in that instance? And also to make sure to prepare for the element of surprise. I mean, if we've been mesmerized in December about the takeover of HTS in Syria, let's ask ourselves, who are the actors now that we are not considering, right? Who are the actors we don't have a direct line to? Where are we flying blind? And also where are the information gaps? And the reason I'm highlighting the importance of analysis is that if you do not agree on the analysis and you have different outcomes, you will also end up having different strategies. So I think that is the very basic for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you for this very enriching conversation. It was a real pleasure to have you all. But with this webinar, conclude our series. It was a pleasure to collaborate with Cass on these issues, and we look forward to further cooperation and further discussions on these topics. Thank you all, and have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.